Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. My name is Astrid Garcia-Ochoa. I'm the Deputy Director for Future of California Elections, and I'll be your moderator for today. Future of California Elections is a collaboration of election officials, reform advocates, civil rights organizations, and we all work together to expand participation and modernize elections. I want to thank the James Irvine Foundation for their generosity in supporting our work. We're going to go ahead and get started on today's webinar entitled Registering to Vote at the DMV Changes This Election Cycle. And also just letting you know that we will be live captioning this event, and we have just sent you the link via the URL in the chat page section that you can see in the upper left-hand side of your screen. If you click on that link and open a second window, you'll be able to see the live captioning. So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Our goal for today is to discuss the important changes to voter registration at the Department of Motor Vehicles. These changes are in advance of the new motor voter law, which is expected in 2017, and we wanted to bring everyone together to have this important presentation so that you and your networks are informed on how to successfully register to vote if you are using the DMV. We are joined today by a great panel of speakers. We have Trudy Schaefer with the League of Women Voters of California, Paul Spencer from Disability Rights California, Ophelia Medina with NILEO Educational Fund, and Lori Schellenberger with the ACLU of California. Our presenters will explain why the DMV is making these changes, the importance of voter education to ensure that voters are registering correctly, and also we'll discuss the importance of the DMV compliance under the National Voter Registration Act. Thank you to our panelists today for joining us and for providing this important information. Our first speaker this afternoon is Trudy Schaefer. Trudy is the Senior Director of Program with the League of Women Voters of California. Trudy works on a broad range of projects in community, education, and advocacy. Her focus is on League priorities including voting rights, election reform, money in politics, and budget issues. Thank you, Trudy, for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to pass it over to you now.
Thank you, Astrid. I'm going to begin the webinar with an overview and something of an explanation of voter registration services at the Department of Motor Vehicles, the DMV, and how we came to where we are today. Our first slide, my first slide, is about the NVRA, National Voter Registration Act of 1993. So this 20-year-old federal law provides that, among other things, DMVs across the country must provide a voter registration opportunity simultaneously with driver's license and ID applications, renewals, and changes of address without requiring a person to provide duplicative information. The voter registration portion of the driver's license form may not require more information than is necessary to ensure that an applicant is eligible to register to vote and to prevent duplicate registrations. However, until the last month or so, voter registration at the DMV has not looked that way. What one does is one has to fill out a separate voter registration form. You can indicate to the DMV that you do want to register to vote, and your signature is there, but then it's a separate voter registration card, the same card that we see in other circumstances. In February of last year, several organizations, including members of the Future of California Elections and a couple of others, sent a pre-litigation notice letter of noncompliance with the NVRA, the motor voter law, to the Secretary of State, saying that we did not believe that the DMV registration process was compliant. And as a result, for the current year's budget, the DMV and Secretary of State Alex Padilla requested and received some $2.3 million for current year software and hardware upgrades. However, the process that the DMV is now implementing at the DMV field offices is far from an integrated approach, which we believed was envisioned at that time during what is called the May Revise process of last year's May. Our concerns about the process are significant, both because of their impact on registering and voting in the June primary, and because this new system will provide the infrastructure, we believe, for implementing AB 1461, the new motor voter program that you'll hear about later. Could you go to the next slide? I would say for the last 3 months, the DMV, Secretaries of State, the Secretary of State representatives and parties to that notice letter and additional stakeholders have been engaged in meetings to inform the best practices for implementation of that May revise new process to improve motor voter compliance and to modernize the DMV voter registration system. We're pleased with certain improvements in the registration process that are rolling out right now, and that will have an impact on registration for the June primary. In particular, online voter registration by DMV renewal applicants using pre-population of COVER, the California Online Voter Registration Form, is promising to have very positive results. So let's look at what is the improved voter registration system at the DMV like. First, the driver license or ID applicant is asked on the standard application form called DL44 about his or her eligibility, whether he or she wishes to register to vote, to change address, or to update his or her registration. If the basic answer to that is yes, the information required to complete a voter registration application is electronically transferred to the Secretary of State, and that person is registered to vote. However, as you see in the second bullet, voter registration involves additional optional questions about party preference, language preference for election materials, whether one wishes to be a permanent vote by mail voter, and whether one wishes to be a poll worker. Those important questions are not asked at the DMV unless and until the applicant goes to a separate place and logs into a touchscreen terminal, the touchscreens that have been used and continue to be used to give driver's license applicants their written test. Now, this whole system rolled out. The online portion began in early April. The rolling out of the 170 or so field offices around the state was completed with a large number of them going online on April 25th. And the results are interesting and, as I said, especially for the online voter renewals, very, very good. Some 13,000, almost 13,000 registrations online from April 1st to April 28th. However, and if you will go to the next slide, the early signs indicate that for those who are choosing to register to vote under the new system at the field offices, about a third of the people who say they want to register to vote or to change their registration do not complete the touchscreen process. And what this means is that important information such as party preference, language preference, and the others will not be recorded for them if they're new registrants. And that one-third estimate of how many are not going to the second step is quite consistent with the number of people who are not required to go to the touchscreen terminal as part of their regular DMV transaction. Now, for those applicants who skip the touchscreen, the Secretary of State will has started to send follow-up letters telling them that they can complete their optional information. However, to do that, those voters will have to re-register to vote on their own initiative, either by going online or by seeking out and obtaining a voter registration card from their county elections office or in one of the places where cards are stocked. We believe that that interrupted registration process at the field offices should only be an interim phase in the DMV's modernization effort. We believe that that is just an unsatisfactory way for this whole system to be working. Although voter registration will be easier for many under that process, the process is vulnerable to human data input error. It can be confusing to customers at the DMV, and it risks depriving underrepresented communities of equal access to services, in particular those people with disabilities and those in need of language assistance or who wish to indicate that they want to get their voting materials in their own language. As you'll hear in a moment from Paul Spencer, people with disabilities are likely to be disproportionately represented in that one-third who do not complete the touchscreen process, as they may be getting a state ID card if they are unable to drive, and as an example, thus they're not required to take the driver test. Additionally, the DMV has been reluctant to verify that this current process is accessible for people with disabilities. And so when we've talked to the budget committees of the legislature, we're mentioning that future funding should require a much better planning for an accessible registration process. If we think about language minority voters who don't complete the touchscreen process, they're also at a greater disadvantage because the language in which they complete their original driver's license or ID card, the DL44, that language will not be transmitted to the Secretary of State given the limitations of the processes as they are now at the DMV. So not knowing in which language the follow-up mailing should be sent, the Secretary of State is sending a 3-page multilingual letter in 10 languages, which we think potentially adds confusion and is quite possibly going to be ignored by most recipients. So, and as I said before, only if you get that letter and you realize that you didn't complete your entire registration process, you have to complete a whole new voter registration form and indicate a language preference. And that's the only way that a person could receive translated voting materials that are required under Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act. So we're continuing to work with the DMV and the Secretary of State to achieve a process that really is seamless. We're pleased that there have been significant improvements so far, but there's a long way to go before we really are what we would consider compliant with the old federal motor voter law. And of course, as I've said, this process is laying the groundwork for the new motor voter program, and we really have to see that those corrections that are needed will be part of the process of the implementation of that new program. So Astrid, let me hand it back to you, and we can hear from Paul.
Thank you, Trudy. So next up is Paul Spencer. He is the staff attorney for voting rights with Disability Rights California, and he works to ensure voting statewide is accessible for persons with disabilities. Thank you, Paul, for joining us today.
Thank you. So hi, I'm Paul Spencer, and can we move to the first slide, please? So I'm here to talk to you, a little bit about, what this DMV registration process is like from the perspective of a person with disabilities. And I think what I'm going to talk about also kind of helps, give you a framework of what this current system looks like. But real quick, before we jump into it, this is important, especially for voters with disabilities, because, there are probably about 6 million eligible voters with disabilities in California, and registering to vote is an important first step in participating in this process. So, for better or worse, the DMV touches all of our lives. I know the DMV and the dentist are kind of right up there with the things you really enjoy thinking and going to. But, right now, unless you've been to the DMV recently, there are touch screens now where you would take your driver's test. If you haven't renewed your driver's license in a long time, you probably didn't use these touch screens. A little later in my presentation, we'll get more into what that touch screen actually looks like. But so let's talk about, what we want a voter registration system to look like at the DMV. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So, we want an accessible system that's private and independent when someone registers to vote. We're going to talk more about private and independent in the next couple slides, but real quick, let's just talk about what accessible means. I mean, accessible refers to direct access without assistance. So the design of the products, the services, the training for the staff, all needs to incorporate persons with disabilities. Accessible also refers to that it's easy to use, that you can reach it, that you can enter information, that you can speak with it, that you can hear it. So right now, this current voter registration process, it's problematic on the accessibility front because, the stakeholders involved here, we really haven't gotten a clear view of what this system looks like. We've asked to see, their accessibility training documents. It doesn't look like there are any. And, to explain what this process is like, it's really important that the staff is trained at the DMV to help people register to vote and then also understand how this might be different for people with disabilities than people with disabilities that might have in the past used the touch screen to take the driver's test, for example. So, an accessible voting system, it's not only going to have that touch screen, it would also have an audio component, which it's not really clear what the DMV's current audio component looks like. There might actually be one. But other features which you might see in the accessible voting booth context are something like a sip and puff, an actual physical keyboard to write in, like for example, on your voter registration, if you register other, you might need to write in the party. So a lot of people are used to using like the keyboard that shows up on your touch screen, but some people with disabilities actually need a physical keyboard to touch. There's also, voice activated, a touchscreen that works in conjunction with audio and visual. and maybe also plugins for people that use joysticks or someone that uses a Tekla switch. It's a relatively new technology. Tekla, it's T-E-C-L-A. The YouTube videos online are pretty cool, actually. But and then physical tactile buttons might be important. So let's move on to the third slide. So what happens when a person with disabilities goes to the DMV? There's a picture in this slide. This picture is it's actually like a picture taken of the DL-44, which is the form that Trudy talked about. So that's the actual paper form you fill out when you come into the DMV to either get your license or renew your license. And this picture is zoomed in on the back on the voter registration question area. So someone on here checked, yes, I am a U.S. citizen, and then the next box they checked, it's a little blurry, but it says, I wish to update my political party preference or other voter registration information. So that means that at this trip to the DMV, while you're working on getting your new license or license for the first time, you should be sent to this touchscreen process. So Drudy already talked about it, but the basic order is you fill out this DL-44, you turn it back in, you see the technician. That's the front desk person at the DMV. They send you the touchscreen terminal. You take the driver's test and you also register to vote. You come back to the technician. You get your photo and fingerprint, and then you're on your way. So the problem is right now these touchscreen terminals are in a separate area. They are not at the desk with the touchscreen, with the actual technician. So you need to go somewhere else at the DMV to go fill this out. It's not an intuitive, streamlined process. Personally, I went and renewed my license on Monday to see what this is like. And all four of the technicians I saw, that they'd never sent me to the touchscreen terminal. They had put their system in a week ago. They'd had no training for how to use this. It was pretty frustrating, to be honest. And from what we've seen so far, the staff, the DMV has not issued specific training for its staff on how to, A, get people to even use this touchscreen terminal for voter registration, but then also how would it be different for a person with disabilities registering to vote. The DMV instead, they sent us, a summary of their basic disability awareness training, which is fine. That's good that they do that, but it's not taking into account that this voter registration process is going to have unique concerns for DMV customers, and especially DMV customers with disabilities. So let's go and move on to the fourth slide, because I think you guys are deadly curious, what does this touchscreen terminal look like? So this photo's kind of a joke. This is a touchscreen terminal of a picture of a touchpad that you would see at your basic grocery store, at the self-checkout line. When I was at the DMV talking to the office manager there, she had commented that these touchscreen terminals are pretty similar to the grocery store terminal. And I think it's a good thing to see. It is a pretty familiar technology when you're there, but if you are a person with disabilities, you probably don't use this self-touch-out because it might not be accessible. And it's the same thing at the DMV. But it is the basic kind of thing you see at the grocery store. It's vertically mounted. The DMV I went to, they did have some that were lowered at a table, so someone in a wheelchair could probably use it, but it wasn't clear beyond that what the accessible system was to use the touchscreen terminal. So here's, the things that this process needs that aren't there now. There needs to be a robust staff training on voter registration, especially for people with disabilities, the unique concerns they might have. Because the one issue here too is that it's not just this accessibility problem, it's also that the process the DMV has set up now is not private and it's not independent. So right now, the DMV's response is if someone with a disability needs help with the touchscreen terminal, they go to the touchscreen room and the office manager will help them there. That's it. So think about the privacy concerns there of having to tell this office manager in a busy room. This really isn't a private room. It's almost like the DMV I went to was just one wall of the DMV at these touchscreen terminals. This person would ask you out loud, what's your political party? And then you tell them back and the office manager enters it in for you. Like that's not private and it's definitely not independent. This process right now, it's not intuitive or streamlined, so it almost encourages people not to register to vote. Think how stressful the DMV is anyway when you're there. And then when you finally see that technician, they're going to send you to the other side of the room to do this touchscreen terminal and then come back and then keep going. And when I was there, the staff wasn't even trained how to do this. If you are a person with disabilities, you're going to be unlikely to want to go through with this process. And it's important, as Trudy talked about, it's not that you're you would be registered to vote when you're filling out that DL44 if you check the box, but unless you've answered those other questions, it doesn't really empower you to vote. I mean, think about it. If you don't have a party selected, you're not going to be able to vote for the president in this upcoming primary. So when we're trying to reach voters that have been historically disenfranchised, I mean, imagine how frustrating it would be that maybe you were finally registered to vote, but because this process was so cumbersome, you weren't actually able to pick a political party. And then the final thing the DMV needs to work out is baking in accessibility into this process as they go forward. Because right now, the staff hasn't been trained. They've reworked these touchscreen terminals that used to be for their driver's test now to do this voter registration aspect. And the accessibility needs of people with disabilities that are going to be registering to vote are different than people that might have been taking the driver's test in the past. And disabilities don't just happen in isolation. Sometimes people have combinations of disabilities, and that thought process needs to be thought about as the DMV is going forward. So I want to thank you for your time, and I'm going to turn it back over to Astrid.
Thank you, Paul. And now to our next speaker is Ofelia Medina. And Ofelia Medina is the Director of State Civic Engagement Policy for NALEO Educational Fund. She is responsible for implementing the organization's technical assistance and professional development program activities related to state voting and civic engagement policy. And Ofelia will talk to us about language access with this new system. Thank you, Ofelia.
Thank you so much, Astrid. So hello, everyone. And we also wanted to talk about California's large and significant population of limited English proficient voters and address and highlight some of the ways that voter registration process at DMV, or highlight some of the ways that this process is happening at DMV, and also share some of our concerns. Next slide. For our limited English proficient voters, voter registration is a very, very important step into really participating into Americans' democracy. So again, this is really important for our community. Next slide. So the DL44, or the DMV form, as Trudy and Paul have mentioned, that form is available currently in 10 languages at all of the 174 field offices. These languages include English, Spanish, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Hindi, Thai, Vietnamese, Tagalog, and Khmer. However, while the form is available in these 10 languages, the language in which the DL44 is completed on will not be transferred over to the SOS. So for example, if a customer wishes to register to vote and on the DL44 form checks the voter registration box, even if the form was submitted in another language, let's say for example Vietnamese, this does not mean that the customer will receive their election materials in Vietnamese. The DMV customers will need to visit the touchscreen terminal, or the separate room that Paul spoke about. In this two-step process, they need to select the language in which they receive all their election-related materials using the touchscreen screen. And language preference is among one question among other questions, such as whether or not they want to register to vote by mail. For those that would like to register to vote during the DL44 piece, but for some reason fail to visit the touchscreen terminal, either because they're there just to apply for an ID and not a driver's license, they will receive their voting materials in English if they fail to take one extra step. Again, this is even if they complete their DMV application in a language other than English. That doesn't necessarily mean that they will be receiving their materials in that language. Instead of this two-step process where the limited English proficient voter needs to go to a separate step to ensure that they receive all the materials in that language, what would be better if a DMV system would enable the technician to really just enter the language in which the DL44 was completed, and then just transfer that field to the Secretary of State to really ensure that the follow-up is done in the language of the customer's preference. If any of our limited English proficient voters or customers need any language assistance throughout the whole process, DMV technicians should be available to assist if they speak the language that the voter speaks. In any case that they don't, DMV will be connecting voters via a phone or a line with a technician that speaks that same language. And again, this is the way that language assistance right now is provided for those that wish to register to vote, but for some reason a DMV technician at the site doesn't speak that language. Next slide. So let's say that, for example, one of our voters said that they would like to register to vote on the DL40 form, but failed to skip the touchscreen terminal. What would happen? In this case, he or she will receive a multi-language 4-page letter, like the one Trudy mentioned earlier, from the Secretary of State. Pretty much like the one that you see on your screen. That's only page 1, but it's 4 pages. This letter is also available in all of the previously mentioned 10 languages. The letter not only congratulates them on registering to vote, but it also mentions that the application did not include very important additional voter information, including, again, the language preference and whether or not they wish to register to vote by mail. If they wish to add the language preference to the voter registration, the letter states that they should either do one of the 3 things. One, they can re-register online. They can either pick up a voter registration card or form at their county elections office, at a public library, at a post office, a DMV, or at other state offices. Or 3, they can contact the Secretary of State's office and have a form mailed to them. This is the only way that they can capture the language preference if the customer or the voter failed to visit the touchscreen terminal during their DMV visit. If for any reason the customer or voter also ignores the letter, it ends up on the kitchen counter, ends up somewhere else, they will continue to receive their election-related materials in English and not the language of their preference. So again, this two-step process is very confusing just for us general folks, but especially for our limited English proficient voters, which is why voter education and also education for DMV technicians is really, really important. We need to motivate people not only to register to vote, but also update their voter registrations at DMV and emphasize that they really do need to take that affirmative step at the DLV 44 and in the touchscreen to really register or update all of their voter information. If not, again, they will continue to receive their election-related materials in English. And also education for the DMV technicians is especially important. We need to ensure that they offer proper language assistance throughout any of the process of voter registration at the DMV. If anyone has any language access issues or questions or concerns, they should be able to really speak to someone and not just be able to wait for someone on the phone to answer any of the questions. Again, voter registration at the DMV, while it will enable many to register to vote, it's not the optimal system in place that we have right now for our limited English proficient voters. Thank you, Astrid.
Thank you, Ophelia, for highlighting those issues. Our last speaker to close up this panel before we transition to Q&A is Lori Schellenberger, Voting Rights Director for ACLU of California. Lori advocates for statewide and local election reform to reduce barriers to voter participation. Thank you, Lori, for joining us. Lori? Sorry, we're having some technical difficulties right now. Give me 1 second, and we will get Lori on the line. As we try to identify the line for Lori, why don't we go ahead and Lori, can you see if you're there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, I
Great.
was just suggesting that maybe Trudy could do my part. That was
Great,
a painfully long time to have my picture posted.
Thank you for joining us. Apologies for the technical difficulties, and we'll now continue with our presentation.
All right. Thanks, everyone, and thanks to Future of California Elections for putting this on. I wanted to cover just a few things, and then I was going to be talking more about next steps and what this means for the future. There were just a few other things that we wanted to cover. I mean, I think the big takeaways are that voter registration is easier for a lot of folks, but we're very concerned about the folks who may be slipping through the cracks. So folks who are being registered as a result of opting to register to vote on that DMV application, if they don't go to the touchscreen terminal, as you've heard, then a lot of important optional information is missing from their voter file. And the concern is that there is not a very clear way to follow up with those folks. We can't follow up with them in language, and they're getting a multilingual letter. And in addition, they can't simply go in and correct their voter registration. They have to re-register to vote, and that's a particular concern with a primary approaching, and in particular for those folks who want to participate in the Republican primary, they're going to be shut out if they didn't indicate a party preference. So we want to make sure the information is getting out to communities that if you registered to vote at DMV and you did not complete that process, that you need to re-register to vote if you want to indicate a party preference, a language preference, or if you want to vote by mail ballot. So I wanted to talk about a couple of other processes at DMV that involve changes of address and updating voter information. Right now, you can check a box that says you want your address changed. You can check a box that says you want to update your registration information. And that triggers a couple of things at DMV that we're still working on. Right now, if you're moving within the same county, your address will be updated for voter registration purposes. And I think DMV and the Secretary of State have made improvements to that process so that those are processed properly. But if you're moving to a new county, you need to re-register to vote at this point. You will still have to submit a new registration. So we want to make sure people understand that. Starting this summer, that will not be the case. There was a law passed that now allows, and it's being implemented, that will allow for inter-county transfers of address, meaning whether you move within the same county or somewhere else in the state, your address will get processed. But that won't be in effect until June or July of this year, so we want to make sure people are aware of that. The other issue that has come up is that people who indicate that they want to update their registration information, so I'm already registered to vote, but I want to change something about my voter registration. Maybe I want to change my party preference so I can participate in a primary. If I check that box on that DMV application, that's actually getting treated behind the scenes as a new voter registration. And so the way that's processed is it's being sent as a new registration, and if I do not go to the touchscreen terminal, and let's say I was previously registered to vote as American Independent Party, and now I want to register as a Democrat or a Republican, that won't be reflected unless I go to the touchscreen. And my voter file will get reset so that those fields will be cleared. So we just want to make sure that people who indicate they want to update their registration are being informed that they must go to the touchscreen terminal. Now, it's our belief that if all of this were unified so that no one could leave DMV without completing the voter registration process, we could solve almost all of these problems. And so I want to talk now about what's next and what we're hoping to see happen over the course of the next year in terms of shoring up some of these holes in the system where we see people falling through. One of the things we're doing is advocating with DMV, and we've talked to the legislature and budget staff about the fact that we want to see a system that ensures that that touch screen process is incorporated into people's DMV transaction. So what that means, right now 62% of people have to take a driver test, and so they have to go to the touchscreen terminal. Another 38% don't have to do that, and so there's no reason for them to go to the touchscreen terminal other than they're being told they should go there to finish the voter registration process. And what we're seeing is that people aren't rule followers, and they aren't doing that. So we want to see that piece of the voter registration process incorporated into the DMV transaction for everyone. So if I'm applying for a state ID and I don't have to take a driver test, I'm still going to be going through a step that includes the voter registration piece so that no one's walking out with an incomplete voter registration form. The other thing we're advocating for is changes to that driver's license form. Paul showed it very briefly on the screen, what the new voter registration language looks like on the driver's license and state ID application. It's very confusing right now, and we're working with DMV to ensure that that language is clearer and more clearly explains to people what their options are, that hopefully they just have to check one box in order to be registered to vote and not answer questions about citizenship. But everyone should know that there are lots of eyes on this, and that we feel DMV shares our concern about ensuring that non-citizens don't inadvertently register to vote. And so I think everyone has that same interest and is working to make sure that does not happen. And so the other thing we're advocating for is that any system that is implemented, whether it's the current one or the changes that we hope to see, is fully accessible to people with disabilities, and that includes written protocols and full training for DMV staff on how to provide assistance for people with disabilities throughout the process, that any machine, whether it's a touchpads or touch screens, that any machine be fully accessible for a wide range of disabilities and fully tested before it's purchased and put into use. One of the things we're doing as we advocate for these changes is ensuring that it's done in conjunction with what's about to happen in California, which is the implementation of a law passed last year, and there was a lot of excitement around that, and that's California's new motor voter law. And so as that implementation begins, which it's beginning now with DMV's budget request to implement that, we want to make sure that this discussion about improvements is included, because the infrastructure that DMV has built right now for this current system is the infrastructure they plan to use for 1461 or new motor voter implementation. Do you want to go to the next slide, Astrid? And with that, I just want to talk a little bit more about how this is, how what just happened is different, or if there are any difference between what new motor voter would be and what changes are being contemplated on the horizon. One of the things that we really want to emphasize is that California's new motor voter law is sometimes confused with Oregon's, and it's quite different in that in California, no one is going to be automatically registered to vote by virtue of the fact that they have previously gone to DMV or when they go to DMV in the future to get a driver's license or state ID card. Someone will always have to take some step in order to be registered to vote at DMV. And so what new motor voter really required for the most part was that DMV build a system to electronically transmit information to the Secretary of State, both the required and the optional voter registration information. And they built that system. There is this data transfer now happening. And so the issue is we want the new motor voter implementation to include a solution that ensures that all of that information is captured on the front end and sent to the Secretary of State, and that we don't face this problem of what we're seeing right now, in the early stages at least, of consistently 1/3 of people walking out the door without providing that information. So any funding and discussions and rules and regulations around 1461 implementation should include a solution to that problem, and that's what we're advocating for. The only other change that's possible under the new motor voter law is that they could change the wording of the question from opt-in as opposed to opt-out. Right now it asks you if you want to register to vote, and you check a box to say you do. There's discussion that what would happen is that they would make it an opt-out, so that instead you're checking a box if you don't want to be registered, but it's not clear exactly how that would work. I think there will be lots of discussions about that moving forward, but those discussions have not yet begun. And that's it, Astrid, for me.
Great. Thank you, Lori, and thank you to all of our presenters for bringing up this important change at the DMV that's happening right now. So we're going to transition now to questions. And so if you do have a question, please go ahead and raise your hand using that raise hand feature in the upper left-hand side of your screen. Can you unmute it real quick?
The conference has been unmuted.
So I've unmuted all the lines, so if you have a mute button on your own phone, please go ahead and mute it at this time so we don't get any background noise. But our first question comes in from Ruthie Goldhorn.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for this webinar. I did send in under chat with the presenter. There's a particular DMV office. It is classically exampled. It's on Sycamore Canyon Drive in Riverside, East Riverside. It was built in 2002, and
the city of Long Beach continue to realize significant long-term improvements along our coastline and beach.
Sorry, Ruthie. If folks can go ahead and mute their telephone, please.
Area
I was hearing somebody's radio station.
Safely and properly disposing household hazardous,
well, I can read your
okay, that's fine. Yeah, I think that would probably be easier. I sent in two items, and the second one has to do with adding a question to the voter registration affidavit so that we can possibly track much better or at all. You pulled up my question.
The conference has been muted.
I'm sorry, folks. Ruthie, I apologize. It's easier to mute the line. We don't want anybody getting some damage to their hearing with this call. So if you could please go ahead and type in your questions. I'm happy to facilitate the Q&A. And so Ruthie's question was if we could add a question about do you need an accommodation to complete this form or to vote? So this was talking about the affidavit for voter registration. So Paul, I don't know if you could answer some of that, if you guys have worked on some of those questions.
Yeah, this is Paul speaking. So Lucy, that is a really good question, and a lot of people have brought up that suggestion. But my organization, Disability Rights California, and a lot of people in the disability community are really uncomfortable with having to disclose a disability on the form. So that's one concern. And then another concern too is that not everyone who would need assistance with this process might not consider themselves disabled. So it's a really well-intentioned idea, but there's some troubling aspects, and then there's also it's just that its ability to really capture the data is probably limited. So, but thank you. I mean, it is a good suggestion that people have. It's just it's problematic.
Thank you. And also, Ruthie had messaged that in her experience with the DMV in Riverside on Sycamore Canyon, she was sharing that the touchscreen machines are actually located over near the bathroom, and so sometimes the lines get confused. So thank you, Ruthie, for sending in that observation about some of the challenges that folks can face.
And I agree. Lucy, in my DMV, they are like pressed up against the left side wall. It's a really odd sort of fix to where they're placed. So and I don't really think it's too good or accessible for people with disabilities.
Thank you, Paul. Any other questions from the audience? Or if our panelists want to add additional comments, please do so as well. Lori, Ophelia, or Trudy?
That I add
to know how to educate voters. Am I still,
Trudy, go ahead. I think you're on mute.
Okay, am I now unmuted?
Yes, yeah, go ahead, Trudy.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment that I hope that the people who are on this call who do a lot of voter education and encouraging of registration and voting will take to heart the idea that right now probably the best thing we can do for the short term is encourage when you're getting someone to register to vote and when you're spreading the word about the DMV process. We can praise a lot of it, but make it really clear that going to those additional questions is really important, and that applies especially if they're re-registering and don't want their current optional answers to be deleted. But it's also, of course, important for everyone, and especially with the moves now before the primary, and then there will be an extra effort all through the summer and especially in the fall to get people registered and voting in the general. We want to make sure that that is uppermost in everybody's mind, while at the same time we're looking at longer-term solutions to make the whole process better.
Great. Thank you, Trudy. Ophelia, did you want to add on?
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize again the education piece, especially going off of what Paul and the question was addressing regarding where the touchscreen terminals are located. Many times when we visit the DMV, we see many posters and many signs, so we might not automatically just know where the touchscreen screens are, and especially for those that are limited English proficient voters, finding a touchscreen might not be the easiest thing. So again, that goes to everyone, the organizations that are doing voter registration work, to really emphasize the piece that they shouldn't be leaving the DMV office without visiting the touchscreen. The DMV does have multiple posters, or should have multiple posters, sort of like the one that you see on your screen right now that says register to vote with a touch in many languages. But again, making sure that our community knows that they should be keeping an eye for those posters, and again, making sure that they visit the touchscreen before they leave the DMV.
Great. And Lori, any final thoughts as well as we close up the panel?
No, I think everyone covered it. I mean, I think it's just echoing that same thing. We really want to make sure that voters understand the process and that accurate information is getting out there.
Great. Well, thank you to our panelists for sharing with us the latest developments at the DMV. We know that there will be ongoing changes at the DMV in the coming months and next year as well, with the implementation of the new motor voter law. But in the meantime, we want to thank all our registrants for joining us to listen to this important message and helping us get this information out to those that are registering to vote at the DMV, that they need to identify that they want to register to vote when they're applying or renewing their driver's license or ID card, and most importantly, to not leave the DMV without selecting their preferences. And if you have registered to vote recently at the DMV and you just want to confirm where you're at in terms of your voter registration deadline, here's a quick reminder. Voter registration deadline is May 23rd, and you can go to the Secretary of State's website. There's an easy-to-remember URL, calballots.org, that directs you there, and you can verify your voter registration form, your voter registration with your county to make sure that you're registered by May 23rd. So thank you to everyone for joining us today. This information will be available on our website in the coming days, and we hope that you continue to join us for Future of California Elections Democracy webinars in the coming months. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.